We're going to take a look at how to perfectly graft a 1x1 rib. I've prepared my ribbing ahead of time with an initial waste yarn swatch, which is in the green, with one row of waste yarn in a contrasting colour, and this is my quick release row, and both the green and the pink stitches were knit. Then I picked up my working yarn, which is the purple, and I worked in 1x1 rib, and I kept on working, and in order to save time I broke my strip off in the middle, but we're going to imagine this strip is continuous all the way to this end. At the end of my strip I finished one row short of my final total of purple rows and completed it by working the last row in pattern but in my pink yarn. So when I picked up my pink yarn, I actually was on a wrong side row and I went knit, purl, just as I would had I been continuing in the purple yarn. Under normal circumstances, I would graft this together with this piece of attached yarn, the working yarn. But for practice purposes, I'll show you how to do this starting in the middle of the row. And our aim is to join the heads of these stitches to the bases of their great-great-great-grandparents. And the two waste yarn flaps will help us to hold the stitches and show us where to sew. This is going to be a perfect graft because we're grafting the heads of these stitches to the bases of the original purple stitches. 1x1 rib is tricky to graft because it's hard to see the path of the yarn, but what we're aiming to do is to follow where the pink yarn intersects with the rib on this side and where the pink yarn intersects with the rib on this side. And because we're going to start in the middle, I'm going to pick the third column in. 1, 2, 3, that's my third knit column, and I'm just going to go up the side, which is exactly what that pink waste yarn has done. This is really just to get me positioned. I'm going to leave enough of my sewing yarn so that I can come back and finish this edge later. And now I'm going to identify the third column of knits on that side. These are the beginning stitches, and if I go around the base of that stitch, copying that pink one, it shows me exactly where to sew. I'm using a slightly different coloured sewing yarn just to differentiate, but I also want it to look like a perfect graft when we're finished. Now if I come back and take that yarn back into that stitch, now what I have to do is follow where the pink yarn goes. So the pink yarn sneaks around and goes up here because this is going to be a purl stitch. And I want to pull these stitches to the same size and shape as the rest of their friends in the knitting. Now when I get to the upper edge, I've dealt with that knit stitch, so my next one to copy is this pink stitch here. So if I do what the pink stitch does, comes up from underneath, goes back down again, and when you're doing purls you often end up having to do 2 needle movements. Now we come back to this side again, and I've only half done this purl. So what I have to do is I have to come back in the same direction as that pink yarn, and I can swing my needle round and up into the knit. Now I'm in the side of the knit once more, so I can go around the base of the next knit. The knits are easy. And back into the stitch I came from. So all I'm doing is mimicking this pink yarn. So that piece of blue yarn equates to the first side of that pink stitch. So those two are equivalent. And then I come round back into here and up into the next stitch. Over to the opposite side, up, and down, back down to complete this purl stitch, and up into the side of the knit. And starting to look like rib. I'm going to continue that same routine around the base of the upper knit, back into the knit it came from, copy that piece of pink yarn, and I'll continue with that all the way till I get to the edge. I'm almost at the edge purl now, so I'm completing that final knit, and the pink yarn goes up here. Now this is the awkward one at the edge, and that's one of the reasons it's easier to start in the middle. But if I fiddle around with that piece of pink yarn and turn it back into something that looks like a knit stitch, then I can copy that, and in fact it's become twisted over because this really should be a purl. So I've turned it so it looks like a purl. It had twisted itself. So I'm going to come up and follow the pink yarn. You develop waste yarn dependency. So it came from there, and I'm following the last leg of that pink stitch. There should always be some of that waste yarn to guide you. It takes a little practice at first, but there is our graft. Now right now you might say, well, that might be okay, but it might not. We always finish back on this lower side, which is the heads of the stitches on the header stitch side, with a complete stitch. So I've got one knit, one purl, one knit, one purl, all the way across, culminating with a purl at the end of the row. Now I'm going to turn the whole thing upside down, which can be a bit disorientating, but I prefer to sew from right to left. But if you prefer, you can continue and sew from left to right. Now on this side here where I started, I just came up the side of a knit, so I've got to go back into the purl, then I've got to complete this purl stitch here, this pink one. So the yarn comes up here. If you have a very long row of stitches to join, starting in the middle is a big help, because then you don't have to pull through quite as much yarn. So I actually went into my purl at the same time, and then I come up into my knit, and I've completed copying this stitch. So the next one I have to do is go around the base of that knit. So I'm in the side of a knit, then back into that same knit stitch to complete it, and then into the column of purls. And I'm going to pursue this right to the edge. Don't be scared to stretch things out as you need to in order to be able to see things, because that's one of the functions of the waste yarn, is to hold things so that you can clearly see them. So I'm going to follow the waste yarn up here and back around the base of this knit. That's my side stitch if we look at it this way, and I've got to go back into that same knit again, and it's one of those messy edge stitches, but if I play around with it I can make it look like an ordinary knit stitch at the edge, and that's completed. Now let's remove the waste yarns. So it all looks fine, the knits all look correct, and if we turn it over we can hardly see the ones that would be purls from the other side, but if you look underneath each pink stitch there is a twin stitch, and we have copied that waste yarn all the way along. Now we have two waste yarn flaps here, and the easiest one to remove to begin with is the final waste yarn. So this was your casting off waste yarn. because if there were a problem and your graft came undone, it would be easy to pick up the purple stitches and re-knit the waist yarn, not a problem. Now, as I get right down here, this should come out nice and easily, unless I've split any plies. And that's all holding together quite nicely. Still looks good. Now we get to the reason I use this one separate piece of waist yarn. I like to have the colours matching on either side, so I know I'm always following the same colour. So in this case, I was following pink on this side and I was following pink on this side, even though the rest of my waist yarn was a different colour. And ideally, you'd use a slippery yarn for this final row of waist yarn, so that it will come out very easily, because it's not as easy to unpick from a cast on edge. And so I'm just gently pulling that yarn through, and because I didn't split any plies, it would pull out. This will now drop away, and there's our rib grafted on one side. There's our rib grafted on the other side, and it is structurally a perfect rib. And had I knit this in a continuous strip, you would have a seamless continuous strip. And had I tackled this from the side of the fabric, where I left enough yarn to sew the whole thing in the original working yarn, I could have grafted the whole thing and only had a beginning yarn and an ending yarn, and have achieved a perfect loop of knitting. Now this is a perfect graft. In another YouTube video, I show you how to do a pretend graft of putting ribs head to head, which is not a perfect graft, it's a compromise. But this is how to do a perfect graft in rib. For more about using waist yarns and a lot more detail in about this technique, see my Finesse Your Knitting 1 DVD. Thanks very much, and I hope you make your stitches smile.